Okay. Firstly, warm welcome to the faculty and the students of Indo-American Cancer Hospital. Thanks for inviting me for this meeting. The topic I'm going to talk about today is management of hyalocholangiocarcinoma. This talk will mainly cover the management of operable hyalocholangiocarcinoma and not the palliative management. So hyalocholangiocarcinomas are commonly known as Klatskin's tumors. Klatskin tumor by definition occurs at or just below the hilum. These are uncommon tumors, but not so uncommon in the tertiary referral HPV centers where they form a frequent percentage, though they're less common than periampullary lower end tumors. They're mostly common in the 6th decade. They're more common in nations, especially in the Far East, Japan, China, and Korea. They're quite common. And even in India, I think in the far eastern region, Bengal, Assam, that side, we do get a lot of patients. The typical presentation is painless progressive jaundice. So when you look at the literature, these lesions are variously described as high incidence of disseminated disease at presentation, sometimes locally very invasive and all that. The main reason is there are several morphological varieties of hyalocholangiocarcinoma, each of which have a different behavior. So the typical operable hyalocholangiocarcinomas which we see in our practice are the small sclerosing growths. So these are like, you don't actually see a tumor, it's a small stricture, almost like it's just a stricture. These tumors are usually relatively slow growing. They're locally invasive. By the very nature, hilum, there are a lot of important structures going next to the confluence of the bile duct, the hepatic artery, the portal vein, the caudate lobe, and all that. They are locally very invasive. And the nodular variety of hyalocholangiocarcinoma, these are mass-forming hyalocholangiocarcinomas. These almost behave like intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas. That means they're not just locally invasive, they form mass, unlike the type 1, which usually has only strictures. These kind of lesions form a mass at the hilum, which is usually detectable on CT scan and EUS. And these go in and actually invade the neighboring structures. And they also have a high degree of metastatic disease, paratic lymph nodes, liver metastasis, lung metastasis at the time of presentation. There's a third variety, which is the rarest of the three. You have the papillary variety. The papillary variety is you have an arborescent papillary form of longitudinal spread. Though the tumor does not involve radially, the tumor does not spread to the adjacent hepatic artery portal vein, but it spreads longitudinally along the bile ducts and above and below. So many times these kind of patients, you'll have skip lesions, and positive margins is a possibility. And though the lesion does not extend outside and invade adjacent structures, because of the longitudinal spread, he might have to do something like a hepatopancreatic duodenectomy. That means because of the lower end spread is so much that you might have to remove the intrapancreatic common bile duct, and the superior extent is so much that to get a margin, you can do a hepatopancreatic duodenectomy. These are the kind of patients in whom even doing that kind of supramajor resections like HPDs can offer a decent survival. So as a group, generally R0 resection is obviously considered the treatment of choice for Klatskin tumors, and the 5-year survival is about 20 to 40%. These tumors are, I mean, the typical the risk factors would be age, male gender, cirrhosis. There's some conditions like oriental cholangiohepatitis and primary sclerosing cholangitis in which you can have these tumors presenting in the setting of a biliary obstruction. So it's very difficult to differentiate whether the jaundice or the worsening is because of the actual biliary pathology like intrahepatic strictures in oriental cholangitis hepatitis, or the benign biliary stricture in the PSC, or is it due to secondary malignancy? Likewise, abnormal pancreaticobiliary union is also predisposed due to hyalocholangiocarcinoma. The symptoms are mainly painless progressive jaundice and pruritus. Usually, fever cholangitis is unlikely in the absence of intervention. Significant weight loss, severe abdominal pain, ascites, and all are features of advanced disease. So when you come to the diagnosis and staging, we'll mainly look at the practical aspects, the pathophysiology and the pathology and all that we can always read up from a book. But Basically, when a patient comes to us, a hilar block is usually diagnosed on an ultrasound. If the ultrasound does not show any liver mets, ascites, and peritoneal deposits, the next step for staging would obviously be a multi-slice triple phase CT scanner. That means a CT with an arterial phase, portal phase, and a late venous phase. So this CT scan, for example, in this patient, it helps you detect a mass. So in the sclerosing variety, you may not have a mass always, but in the nodular variety, especially, you'll have a mass. It looks at the vascular involvement. In this patient, for example, the left portal vein in the umbilical fissure is encased by the tumor. So mainly you are interested in the involvement of the blood vascular supply of the lobe which you're going to leave behind. That is the artery or the portal vein of the remnant liver. You can identify lobar atrophy. For example, in this patient, the left lobe is atrophied because of the complete portal vein involvement. And also, one more advantage is that we can do a volumetry. Volumetry helps you look at the volumes. I mean, when you're doing a major resection like a right hepatectomy or a right trisectionectomy, you have to you look at the remnant liver volume on CT scan and decide what you're going to do about it to optimize that volume. Of course, the CT in the undrained bile duct, you're actually able to sometimes have a look at the confluence, is it forming or not. But an MRCP is a much better investigation for the biliary staging. So for the staging, we know now that ERCP is no more like in any other area. ERCP has not much of a role in a diagnostic role in hyalocholangiocarcinoma. The problem is ERCP, like when you inject contrast, you might fill up only hyalocholangiocarcinomas. Once they go beyond the confluence, they'll have multiple blocks. In the ERCP, you might actually cannulate only one of the systems. You inject contrast into the other systems, infect them, and then the patient gets into problems like recurrent cholangitis. Over the years, I've seen so many patients of hyalocholangiocarcinoma who undergo an ERCP, and post injection of contrast, they just go into a septic shock and flare up and die within 5 to 6 hours with a fulminant cholangitis. So definitely ERCP has no role in diagnosis and staging of hyalocholangiocarcinoma. The investigation of choice is MRCP, which shows the length of the stricture and the extent of the stricture, whether it has spread into the second order ducts on the of either side, and that kind of information. So at the end of your staging, you want to have this kind of a cholangiographic picture. This is the bismuth-Corlett staging. This should not be confused with the bismuth staging that we use for benign biliary stricture. You have the type 1, basically type 1 where the confluence is right and left are connecting. Type 2 in that right and left are separated. Type 3 and 3B is when the tumor goes beyond the confluence into the sectoral ducts. The right anterior and right posterior are separated. Then it's called type 3A. It goes beyond the main left duct and the segment 2, 3, 4 are separated. It becomes type 3B. There's one more variety, type 4, when the tumor has gone beyond the bilateral. So even the left side sectoral ducts are involved and the right side also sectoral ducts are involved. So once you have the basic information of hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you've done your CT scan to assess the operability, the MRCP to get a cholangiographic picture into the type of tumor it is. What next can you use for staging? Definitely EU endoscopic ultrasound is a fairly good investigation. EUS definitely to detect the mass. It's better than the CT and ultrasound with a pretty high sensitivity. It helps you assess things like the local arterial involvement and the portal vein involvement. But if you want more, let's say we want an endoscopic ultrasound guided FNAC, the sensitivity of an EUS guided FNAC is about 70%. So it's not, so when it has a high specificity. If the EUS guided FNAC is positive, it is definitely positive. But if sensitivity, it picks up only 70%, so 30% are missed. More important than that, I'd like you to focus on these 2 points: the negative predictive value and accuracy. So the negative predictive value of a test is when the test says that it's negative, can we tell the patient that, okay, you don't have the disease, you can go home, you don't have cancer. So the negative predictive value from the surgical point of view, it is very important. When a surgeon wants to go ahead and do a surgery for a inaccessible lesion like a head of pancreas mass or a gallbladder mass or a hyalocholangiocarcinoma, what he wants is, if the test is negative, is malignancy ruled out and can I send the patient home? So the negative predictive value of EUS guided FNAC is around 50%. Likewise, the accuracy. The accuracy means the number of total positive, true positives and true negatives divided by the total number of tests. So only 70% of the time, the EUS guided FNAC is giving a correct result. 30% of the time, the result is wrong. Definitely, FNAC, if planned, we should always do a EUS guided FNAC, because the transperitoneal FNAC is contraindicated because of the increased chance of peritoneal metastasis in these patients. Likewise, an intrarectal ultrasound was introduced around 10-15 years ago, in which actually a ultrasound machine is, a radial probe is passed into the bile duct, and you can have a look at the bile duct wall and the layers of invasion, but it's not really available and we don't use it much in actual practice. Another useful investigation is the spyglasscopy. The spyglasscopy around 10 years back, you used to have cholangioscopy used to be done by two endoscopists, one with a mother scope and one with a baby scope. They used to be struggling, two guys simultaneously manipulating with risk of scope breakage and all that. This, I think, is introduced by the Boston Scientific. The spyglass scope basically has a 10 French, around 3.5 mm delivery catheter. So once you actually put like a routine ERCP, you put in a guide wire into the bile duct, and then over the guide wire, this 10 French access delivery catheter, it has a 1.2 millimeter working channel through which a biopsy forceps can go. So this can be advantages. It can be introduced through a standard duodenoscope, and this tip is capable of deflection in 4 directions. So using this, basically you go in, you put in the guide wire, you go in with your scope, you can visualize the tumor and take biopsies. So the sensitivity specificity of this are around 78% of sensitivity. The negative predictive value is about 70%, and the diagnostic accuracy, that means around 2/3 of the time the test is definitely gives you a correct report, and 1/3 of the time you could be a false positive or a false negative. False positives are less likely, but false negatives are very likely. Well, in actual practice, what the problem I have seen when our medical gastroenterologists use this spyscopy is, one is the expense, obviously, and the other is the invasiveness of repeatedly going in and manipulating the system. And the third problem is the amount of tissue is sometimes so little that a definite opinion is not possible, and there are a lot of crush artifacts. So, I mean, when you have these tests, most of the time the big dilemma in the medical and surgical when the surgeons come in and the medical gastroenterologists are trying to obviously prove the malignancy and get a histology with these, especially these two investigations, the EUS and spyglass, which are the two new toys which have come up in the past 2 decades. We have to address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the problem of the negative predictive value. When a negative predictive value means, like I said, if the test is negative, can I ask the patient to go home? That in most of these tests, it's only about maximum 50 to 70%. So when you have a patient with a tumor and everything is fitting into a malignancy, his age, his clinical picture, his radiological image, his biochemistry is all fitting into malignancy. If the test gives a negative predictive value, and then you are still at the end of it, because it's only 50 to 70%. So around 30 to 50% of the patients, the negative patients, can still have a malignancy. So actually you're really stuck. And that way, so unless in specific situations like this, like for example, when you want to do a neoadjuvant protocol or a palliative protocol, obviously you need to have a histology. You have a PSC when you're a primary sclerosing cholangitis patient with a dominant hilar stricture, and you're planning to go for a transplant. I mean, the entire planning is obviously you need to know whether he has a malignancy. So in that kind of situation, also histology is mandatory. In autoimmune stricture, so in the initial years, I've resected a couple of hilar cholangiocarcinomas. One of the patient had a Hashimoto's thyroiditis, another patient had a retroperitoneal fibrosis. This in retrospect gave us clues actually, and we resected these patients, and the histology came as a autoimmune stricture. So when you're suspecting an autoimmune, obviously the treatment would just be steroids. There's no need for surgery. So in these specific, other than these specific scenarios, the question is, do we actually need a histology before we go in for a treatment for a hilar cholangiocarcinoma? So the important thing we need to remember is, yes, absolutely agree that not all hilar strictures are cancerous. So you have the primary sclerosing cholangitis strictures, then you have Mirodzi's syndrome, you have autoimmune strictures, you have tubercular strictures and other histiocytosis. So these kind of strictures can also mimic like hilar cholangiocarcinoma. And if we don't trust the histology, so if on a basis of a classical clinical picture, radiological picture, and the biochemistry, taking them all together, we decide that it's a resectable and the patient is fit, and we take up all these patients for surgery, there is a possibility, this is a large series from MSKCC, that 5 to 10% of the resected lesions will still be benign. That is a possibility. So when you're going in for a surgery, you have to have a discussion with the patient. I think repeated attempts at histology are actually counterproductive. They lead to complications, and sometimes you may never be able to get the histology. Then you'll start under-treating patients. So if a patient is fairly fit and the center has good results for liver resections for hyalocholangiocarcinoma, we should discuss with the patient that yes, there's a very good chance, 95% chance, that based on your clinical and radiological picture, you have a malignancy. There is a rare possibility, we are going in with a histology, that your biopsy may come as negative. Even then, for a benign hilar stricture, the long-term treatment would obviously be a hepaticojejunostomy. So that's how we would justify to the patients, because you can't put in a metallic stent or keep changing stents every 3 months for the rest of the life for a benign stricture. So even in those cases, you have the advantage of treating the jaundice. But yes, there is a possibility that I think 5 to 10% are benign. So this is something which you need to counsel them pre-op, which may also have medical legal significance in the rare case that a patient dies of the surgery, which is always a possibility in hyalocholangiocarcinoma surgery, and the biopsy comes as benign. The other thing to remember is not all malignant hilar strictures are cholangiocarcinomas. So you can have a gallbladder cancer neck mass infiltrating the hilum, HCC with a bile duct thrombus. In fact, I'll show you a similar case with us. And sometimes infiltrating lymph node disease, like let's say a colorectal cancer or a breast cancer with hepatoduodenal lymph node disease, which is causing a hilar stricture. So obviously, any of these, the outcome and the treatment and the prognosis are totally different from a hyalocholangiocarcinoma. So that's one more thing we need to keep in mind, that not all hilar strictures are malignant hilar strictures are hyalocholangiomas. So let's look at the other diagnostic tools we commonly use. One of the important ones is tumor markers. So tumor markers, you have a CA19-9. Again, CA19-9 in obstructive jaundice, it can be elevated in the presence of biliary sepsis. Cholangitis, you can have very high levels, 900, 1000, like that. So as a diagnostic tool, the sensitivity specificity of CA19-9 is not good enough for you to make any treatment decisions. Yes, if the patient has a very high CA19-9 level, which persists after you drain the jaundice also, it would definitely put, these patients would have a higher chance of a metastatic disease. Then we would, you can also do a PET and maybe a diagnostic laparoscopy. So no role for diagnosis. CA19-9 definitely has a role of prognosis. Very high levels, which is persists despite biliary drainage, could indicate stage 4 disease. It can also be used for the follow-up. PET-CT scan in hyalocholangiocarcinoma, it has a very ill-defined role. It's very good for distance staging, that is lung mets, para-aortic nodes, liver mets and all that. But for the primary diagnostic role, so for example, a patient comes to you with a hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you don't have a histology and you want to decide based on your PET-CT that whether it's a malignancy or not, you will very might go wrong, because most of the time, the inoperable ones are the nodular type. The nodular type PET-CT is pretty good. I mean, it's 85% sensitivity, but these nodular ones, on the CT, you find a mass. US get a FNAC is very highly sensitive because of the well-defined mass to target. But the operable ones are the sclerosing, the locally sclerosing, cicatrizing types in which there is no mass. These are basically very fibrotic, slow-growing tumors in which the metabolic rate is very low. So obviously, the PET depends on the metabolic uptake, based on the FDG uptake in the high metabolic zones. So when you have a infiltrative type of lesion, your chance of uptake on PET is very poor. So it doesn't add much value. Brush cytology, again, for the cicatrizing variety, the brush cytology, the cells are very tightly packed within the tumor. So you would try, and the brush cytology is basically, the principle is that you pass a brush through and through and hope to loosen some cells and pick it up. So it has a very poor sensitivity for hyalocholangiocarcinomas. So essentially what I'm saying is, if a patient is young and fit, the same philosophy for a carcinoma head of pancreas, a gallbladder cancer, a liver tumor, or a hyalocholangiocarcinoma, if the patient is fit and you're not planning neoadjuvant therapy, you're going in for and your center has decent results, there is no, and the clinical and radiological picture is suggestive of cancer, there is no need to go for a histology. This is one of the commonest mistakes we make in the clinical management, the medical gastroenterologist, the oncologist, insisting for a repeated histology by which the tumors spreads or multiple interventions are done. and it becomes inoperable. PTC and angiography, honestly speaking, there's not much of role these days. Now we are replaced by MRI, MR angiography, MRCP, high quality CT scans. You get enough information. At the end of it, the commonly used is the Bismuth-Corlett staging, which we discussed previously. The MSKCC staging, and there's an AJCC staging. They basically in that T1, T2 growths are operable, while T3 growths are inoperable because of either bilateral second order involvement or the contralateral vessels involvement or the contralateral lobe atrophy. But yeah, the Bismuth-Corlett is what we use widely in practice. So how does a hyalocholangiocarcinoma become inoperable? So these three are put in red, definite indications. Dissemination is if it's a disseminated tumor, it is inoperable. If there is common hepatic encasement, I mean the same philosophy as we have for in the Whipples for carcinoma head of pancreas. When you resect the portal vein, the outcomes are in patients with portal vein resection and without portal vein resection, when we get an R0, are equally good. So definitely portal vein, if involved, should be resected. While the common hepatic artery encasement, if it is there, the morbidity is high, mortality is higher, and no survival benefit. So common hepatic artery encasement is a contraindication. On the other hand, if you're doing a right hepatectomy and the right hepatic artery is encased, or left hepatectomy, left hepatic artery is encased, it is not a contraindication. The contralateral, so the tumor is spreading into the right anterior, right posterior ducts, and the left lobe is atrophic, and you're not able to make a margin on this side, you're not able to get a parenchyma on this side, then it's a contraindication. So one important thing is, for the sake of the exam going students here, type 4, you can say it's inoperable, but actually in practice it is not. I mean, you have selected cases. So for example, luckily the right posterior segment is the largest sector of the liver. So let's say you have a patient like this. So if you're able to get a good margin of the right posterior duct, you can do, even for type 4, the commonest surgery which can be done is a left trisectionectomy, in which you remove the left lobe, the right anterior sector, and divide here. Obviously, the criteria being that the tumor should not be involving the right posterior hepatic artery, right posterior portal vein, and you should be able to get a bile duct margin. So in those selected cases, when all this is possible, you can actually do a type 4 hyalo. In fact, we did one around 3-4 months back. So type 4 is not inoperable, but I think for the sake of it's a type 4, you can, selected cases, you can do a left trisectionectomy and still be resectable. But for the exam sake, I think if they say, yeah, bilateral sectoral preparation is unresectable. So let's talk about operable hyalocholangiocarcinoma. So once you've done all your staging, I mean, you completed your MRCP, your CT scan, you've made a decision that you have to go ahead with surgery. The question that comes is, how do you prepare the patient? So preoperative biliary drainage. Preoperative biliary drainage is a controversial area in hyalocholangiocarcinoma. Basically, you know, in periampullary, there's so much high quality evidence, so many randomized trials, Cochrane reviews, meta-analysis, which show that there's a clear cut, there is no benefit of preoperative biliary drainage. Doing a preoperative biliary drainage in a patient who doesn't have cholangitis or some other reason to delay surgery, that in fact increases the postoperative septic complications. So in the lower end biliary malignancies and pancreatic malignancies, there is no note for preoperative drainage. Is it the same for hyalocholangiocarcinoma? No. Preoperative biliary drainage is definitely needed in the case of hyalocholangiocarcinoma. Unfortunately, like you have a periamps, because these are rare tumors, and this is not a situation, you know, which it can be very well randomized, because doing major hepatectomies in the presence of jaundice is not safe. We don't have that much of high quality evidence for hyalocholangiocarcinomas. So when you have, so there's a lot of retrospective data about this. So there is clear-cut data in multiple retrospective studies that when patients with jaundice are operated, undergo major hepatectomies, there is increased morbidity in them. And a preoperative biliary drainage reduces complications and mortality in these patients. So the MSKCC study, I mean, MSKCC group, you know, they've done a lot of work on hyalocholangiocarcinomas. They said that in patients in whom the remnant is less than 30%, usually that means the right-sided resections, right hepatectomy, right trisectionectomy, where the remnant is going to be less than 30%. We do right-sided so in these kind of right-sided resections, they without doubt a preoperative biliary drainage improves outcomes. While in the left-sided resections, that means only the left hepatectomy kind of setup, where you are actually leaving more than 40-50% remnant. Like when more than 50% FLR is there in the left side resections, it is optional. You can avoid biliary drainage. So they recommend that where FLR is less than 30%, you recommend biliary drainage. I think in the Indian scenario, what my experience, I have worked in Japan and in the UK, and then practice in India. Generally, our tolerance to doing right appendectomies and cirrhotics, or even these hyalocholangiocarcinoma patients, their tolerance for major appendectomy is lesser than what you have in Japan or UK. So, I mean, even not just that, the cost of managing liver failure, something like the NHS kind of system, patient stays for a month in the hospital with liver failure, needing albumin every day, antibiotics, multiple imaging, nutritional support, and all that. The costs escalate hugely in the Indian scenario. So, in my practice, I would definitely, even for a 40%, any right side resection, most of the time for right side resection, will show you in my data there. If at least the remnant is less than 40%, I would definitely go for a portal vein embolization. Anything less than 40%, it's always safe, and the recovery is much better in the Indian scenario, especially because we can't support the postoperative liver failure. So, to summarize, selective preoperative biliary drainage is very important. Always selective is better, because there is evidence for that, especially for the right-sided tumors. Preoperative biliary drainage is indicated. It is evidence-based, and it also helps in the right lobe hypertrophy. So once you've decided that you need to do preoperative biliary drainage, which side do you drain? So obviously, which side to do the biliary drainage is going to depend on your MRCP picture, whether which side the tumor is. It type 3A spreading more onto the right side, spreading more onto the left side. So looking at this, so generally selective biliary drainage is better than bilateral biliary drainage. So when you're going for a palliative inoperable tumor, you might decide, even then I would say drain around 30 to 40% of the liver. If you drain, that's enough to bring down the jaundice. So you should intervene as less as possible. Only selective biliary drainage, especially when you're planning for surgery. The less number of catheters you put, the less the number of vascular injuries, the risk of catheter dislodgement with cholangitis and bile leaks. So whenever you do only a selective biliary drainage of the liver remnant, future liver remnant. So when you're doing a right appendectomy, if you're planning a right side resection, drain the left lobe. If you're planning a left side resection, drain the right lobe. So this kind of selective biliary drainage, one thing, like I said, 30 to 40% of the liver is good enough to bring down the jaundice, because the non-obstructed lobe, the lobe which you've drained, it compensates. And also, it's not as when you obstruct the portal flow in portal embolization, the kind of hypertrophy it causes. The biliary drainage, selective biliary drainage, is not that much, but when you do selective biliary drainage of the left side for a right appendectomy, it also promotes some hypertrophy of the left lobe. So now, when you say which lobe to drain, this is a very important statement. Like, for example, the patient is not with your hospital, and radiologist calls you saying, or endoscopist calls you that, his jaundice is high, I want to put in a drain. Prioritize always the left side. When in doubt, stay left. Reason is, most of the hyalocholangiocarcinoma resections are right-sided resections. The reason for that, I'll come to you in a couple of slides, but just remember that except in selective situations like type 3B tumors, where the tumor is extending into the second order sectoral ducts, the patients with the left lobe hypertrophy, patients with left lobe atrophy, basically because the left-sided vessels are encased, and left-sided vascular involvement and left lobe atrophy or left-side extensive spread, only in those kind of patients you would do a left-sided resection. But otherwise, most in these kind of three selective scenarios, type 3B, left lobe atrophy, and left portal vein encasement, you drain the right side. Otherwise, most of the hyalocholangiocarcinomas, type 1, type 2, type 3A, you would drain the left side. So we'll come to that part, why left, later. But what is the ideal modality of preoperative biliary drainage? So you have basically ERCP, you have PTBD, and you have the nasobiliary tube. The ERCP drainage has some advantages. It's more physiological. The bile is going into the gut, so it has a more physiological advantage. It has a nutritional advantage. Obviously, bile acids going into the intestine, and there's some degree of immunological advantage. But the problem with ERCP is it has a substantial morbidity and a mortality. So, like I said, an ERCP can be done, But during the ERCP, if you accidentally, you're putting a stent to the right side and you accidentally cannulate the right side, or you cannulate one side accidentally, inject contrast into it, and you're not able to catheterize it, you're not able to stent it, or, and HYLA, unlike the lower CBD strictures, the stent is in lower CBD, the stent is at the bottom and the stricture is at the lower end. The stent goes around 5 to 7 centimeters above that. Here in HYLA, most of the time, the stent is only 1 or 2 centimeters above that. So if it slips down by a couple of centimeters, it is dislodged, the system is infected. So there's a lot of morbidity for ERCP, 25 to 50%, and a mortality of 3 to 5%. This has happened in my clinical practice of the past 10 decades in HPV surgery, at least 4 or 5 times, in which a hyalocholangiocarcinoma has been taken in for an ERCP, they've injected contrast or manipulated, and patient just goes into a septic shock. The PTBD, on the other hand, definitely the higher success rate is there. Higher success rate in terms of the bringing down the jaundice successfully. What you want, a patient comes with hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you're planning for surgery, you want a drainage that brings the jaundice down smoothly without inducing any cholangitis. So PTBD definitely provides better quality drainage with higher success rates in bringing the jaundice down, less incidence of cholangitis, and better resolution rates. The problems with PTBD are the risk of vascular injuries when you're doing the puncture. And of course, in older studies, the PTBDs got into a bit of disrepute because there are some studies which are saying that tumor seeding occurs along the PTBD tract with rates as high as 5 to 10%. But over the years, subsequently, we found that tumor seeding is actually much less in PTBD. And in our practice, I'll come to that, PTBD for operable cases at least is the preferred route of biliary drainage. The ENBD, the nasobiliary drainage, the nasobiliary drainage is when you put the nasobiliary tube across into the across the tumor. So the advantage of that is, of course, you can flush it. There's less duodenal biliary reflux. But the problem with the ENBD tubes, nasobiliary tubes, is that the patient has to be kept in the hospital for the entire 3-week duration, and there's always a risk of dislodgement with the tube hanging out of the nose. So finally, which route is the PBD, preoperative biliary drainage? Well, it depends on institutional experience. When I was at St. James University Hospital at UK, their preferred route was always ERCP. In the US and the UK, they do more of ERCP, while in Japan, China, and Korea, they prefer mostly PTBD. Our policy is for type 1 and type 2, mostly we do the ERCP. So because the chance of it's technically fairly simple, and it's easy to get into the left side also. So ERCP for type 3A, again, to ERCP wise to get into the this side is fairly simple. So it's so optional. You can do an ERCP or a PTBD. If ERCP, if your endoscopist is doing it, he has to be an expert endoscopist in handling HYLAs. The entire process should be done under guide wire guidance without injecting contrast. He should be able to just push in a guide wire into the system which he wants to cannulate, confirm the position just based on the position of guide wire. Once you sort of put a stent across it at that late stage, and when you're definitely going to drain that, he can do a cholangiogram, or preferably if you can avoid a cholangiogram. So if all these things are satisfied, only we can, an expert endoscopist should be doing the ERCP for type 3 strictures. Type 3B, definitely, the right posterior is very difficult to get in by ERCP in this kind of a stricture, in this kind of a stricture. And type 4, so when you have these two type 3B strictures and type 4, even literature says PTBD. So type 1, type 2 ERCP, type 3 one of these two, or type 3B and type 4 is PTBD. Again, it depends on the local expertise. ERCP guy should be good, like I said, without manipulating too much and injecting contrast into the undrained segments. That will make the patient's life miserable. PTBD also, the PTBD catheters, many times the radiologists are able to cannulate, puncture this, but they are not able to cross the stricture. So then what happens, if they do a central puncture, they are just entering the bile duct somewhere at the confluence, the catheter is there for 1 to 2 centimeters. Once the patient goes home, a little bit of movement, the catheter comes out, there's a pericatheter bile leak, perihepatic abscess and all that. So always the PTBD also, we should be able to cross the stricture and internalize. That is the only way we can ensure that the catheter will not displace or dislodge when the patient goes home, and he'll have a smooth resolution of jaundice to get ready for surgery. I hope that's clear. So the duration of jaundice. So actually the biological effects of obstructive jaundice to normalize the mitochondrial function, the reticuloendothelial function, and all that, it takes around 4 to 8 weeks to normalize the adverse effects of jaundice. How quickly the jaundice comes down depends on the duration of jaundice before decompression. Some patients in whom the jaundice has gone up rapidly, after decompression it comes down rapidly. Patients who had a prolonged cholestasis, in fact the liver stops producing, once the pressure goes up in the intrahepatic system, the liver actually stops producing secreting bile across the canaliculi, and then in those kind of cases, even after drainage, sometimes you might just get mucus and no bile in the system, and the jaundice may take quite some time to normalize. The disadvantages of waiting too long, obviously the more longer you wait, the bigger the chance of your ERCP or the PTBD dislodgement. The stent in the bile duct induces fibrosis. There is a possibility of tumor dissemination along the fistula tract, along the catheter tract, the longer you wait. So more than 2 weeks, there is no advantage, but definitely for right-sided resections, I'd want a bilirubin less than 3 mg/cent. So then next is the portal vein embolization. Portal vein embolization. So like I said, in the right-sided hyalocholangiocastinomas, for the right-side resections, when do you do portal vein embolization? In our practice, in the worldwide, if you look at the recommendations, less than 30% definitely is an indication for portal vein embolization. The portal vein embolization is obviously when you, let's say when you're planning a right hepatectomy and your right lobe volume is about 70%, left lobe is only 30%, you are blocking the portal venous inflow of the right lobe. That deprives the right lobe of this nutrition. In the next 3 weeks waiting, the left lobe hypertrophies before the surgery. So there's two things advantage. One is the increase in the volume, the hepatic insufficiency is corrected before the surgery by the hypertrophy of the opposite lobe, non-embolized lobe. And the other more important thing is the actual injury that happens post-hepatectomy, major hepatectomy, is the entire portal flow which is going through the whole liver is now going through one lobe. So there's elevated portal pressure in the left lobe. So this leads to a lot of liver injury, portal hypertension, ascites, and decompensation. So this portal pressure, because of the blockage, it's already adjusted. The elevated portal pressure goes up and sort of stabilizes in the left lobe in those 3 weeks while we wait. So definitely a major right hepatectomy, extended right hepatectomy, left trisectionectomy, we would do a portal vein embolization. When normally, again, in literature, some centers would go 30, 35%. In Indian patients, my personal experience has been the risk of decompensation has been higher. So when the remnant liver volume is less than 40%, we would go in for a portal vein embolization for a safety. I mean, even less than 40%, we would go for an embolization. Once you do the embolization, the waiting time is 3 weeks. There is no advantage to be found by waiting more than 3 weeks. And see, the actual the gain in the function and the is not equivalent to the volume. This thing. So many times it is found that the liver may not hypertrophy that much, but the more than the actual increase in the size, the gain in the function is much more after portal vein embolization. Generally, a kinetic growth of 2%, like that means 2% per week, 2 to 2.5% per week is good enough. So in the 3 weeks waiting period, if the left lobe volume increases by 7 to 10%, you should be pretty happy and go ahead with the surgery. So then one more, of course, one more technique, if you don't have the facility for portal vein embolization, is ALPS, Association of Liver Partition with portal ligation. We'll briefly come to that. We used to do that. I did a couple of cases in around, in the earlier years for hyalocholangiocastinomas. But right now it is considered an absolute contraindication, because when in ALPS, when you divide the liver in an obstructed system, there's a high chance of bile leaks and biliary sepsis is high in hyalocholangiocastinoma. And after initial experience, centers have all given up doing ALPS for hyalocholangiocastinoma. So to summarize, the preoperative preparation, basically you need a preoperative drainage for hepatectomies, especially if the remnant is more than, liver remnant is less than 40%. The preferred route, especially for type 3 and type 4, is a PTBD because of more predictable resolution of jaundice and less complications like catheter slippage and cholangitis. Always we drain the future remnant liver. For right hepatectomy, we drain the left side. No need to drain both lobes of the liver. At least 2 weeks of waiting. And once you do the pre-op, biliary drainage, and for right-sided resections where the remnant is less than 40%, we need a portal vein embolization, following which we wait 3 weeks. So sort of this slide summarizes the pre-operative preparation. So when you come to surgery for jaundice, an important point is, so we need to look at the hilar anatomy here. So here you see that the hilum, by its nature, anteriorly you have the segment 4, posteriorly you have the portal vein hepatic arteries. One big problem is at the hilum, the caudate lobes enter directly into the hilum. So the hyalocholangiocarcinoma, once it forms, by its definition, hyalocholangiocarcinoma is at the hilum. So at that site of origin itself, it invades the ducts and the lymphatics along the caudate lobe duct. So so you might think like this kind of a patient, it's a type 1 cholangiocarcinoma. I might have a good margin. I will just resect the common bile duct and do bilateral hepaticojejunostomies. You cannot, because you will inevitably end up with a positive margin at the caudate lobe ducts. And when you resect the bile duct without a caudate lobe, the caudate ducts, definitely a bile leak will come. It will be like an isolated system with a prolonged bile leak. So literature has shown by 1970s, 1980s itself, there was enough data to show that for hyalocholangiocarcinoma, even for type 1, type 2 hyalocholangiocarcinomas, anyway for type 3 and type 4, isolated bile dissection is not acceptable. Always, because the direct infiltration of caudate lobe by the tumor and the tumor infiltration spread along the bile ducts and the lymphatics, we would need to sort of combine the bile duct excision with a caudate lobectomy. And combining hyalocholangiocarcinoma bile duct excision with caudate lobectomy with hepatectomy is always found to have better R0 margins, better long-term survival, and better reduced local recurrence rates compared to isolated bile duct excision. So there's no confusion in this. For any type of hyalocholangiocarcinoma, be it type 1 or type 2 and the higher ones, always we have to do plan a hepatectomy with a caudate lobectomy. The next statement I'm making is extended right hepatectomy with caudate lobectomy and resection of the extrahepatic biliary tree is the commonest curative operation for resectable hyalocholangiocarcinomas. This is what I was discussing, that most of the time we do right-sided resections. So let's see the reason why. There's several reasons for that. Like you see, people who are doing like for example a Koldogel cyst excisions or CVD, during the Whipples mobilizing the bile duct, you see the right hepatic artery is usually actually embedded in the bile duct wall. So most of the time, it is in fact one of the first structures to be encased by the hyalocholangiocarcinoma. The first structure to be infiltrated is the right hepatic artery, which is most of the time involved. So by that itself, right-sided resections are more often needed. Number 2, you look at the biliary confluence. Here, the right side, the chance when you have a tumor occupying the confluence in this area, the right-sided tumors are the right-sided tumors. The moment they bifurcate, right anterior and right posterior. So the chance of you getting a margin on the right side is very difficult. But in the left side, the left duct has a long extrahepatic course between the hilum and the umbilical fissure. This diagram shows like that many times the segment 4 duct opens at this area, at the umbilical fissure. So you have a long length of bile duct, of extrahepatic bile duct, which you can use to get a good margin on the left side. Unlike in the right side, you cannot get a margin. In this, the entire extrahepatic length could get a margin. Then number 3, the left hepatic artery, as you can see, is given off by the common hepatic artery before it enters the hepatoduodenal ligament. So it's very rare that the left hepatic artery is completely goes along the left border of the hepatoduodenal ligament. It is very unlikely to be encased by the hilar tumors. Then the portal vein resection. Again, the left portal vein, left bile duct has a long extrahepatic segment. So like I said, the sclerosing sort of hyalocholangiocarcinomas, very often either the tumor is actually infiltrated the portal vein, or the amount of additions are so tough that you would have to consider it encasing, and you would like to resect the portal vein. So when you resect the portal vein, the length of the extrahepatic left portal vein it's very easy to do a resection. While doing a right-sided portal vein resection, again, many times you have a trifurcation anatomy or very early branching. So to do a right-sided resection is like the bile duct is very tough, while left portal vein, it's technically much more easier. So for all these reasons, early encasement of the right hepatic artery, less margin on the right side, long length of the extrahepatic left-sided bile duct, less involvement of the left hepatic artery, easier to do the left portal vein resection, and also easier to do the right hepatectomy with choroid lobectomy, because the choroid lobe is essentially an extension of the right posterior sector. Because of all these reasons, most of the time, unless it's a type 3B or a left portal vein is encased or a left lobe is atrophic, the extended right hepatectomy with choroid lobectomy and resection of the external extrahepatic biliary tree is the commonest curative resection for hyalocholangiosarcomas. So like I said, for type 1, type 2, type 3A, we do a right hepatectomy. A lot of, like when I was in the UK, our unit used to do a lot of right trisectionectomies. That means they would remove the entire right lobe 5, 6, 7, 8 and segment 4. I mean, honestly, I feel that's a bit of an overkill, because one of the problems is you get a very small left lateral segment volume that makes the surgery very high risk. And what you need is actually only a bile duct margin. Most of the time, like I said, hopefully tomorrow in our biliary anatomy, most of the time the segment 4 duct actually opens at the umbilical fissure. So to get a bile duct margin, you don't need to remove the entire segment 4 parenchyma. We just remove, now we call it an extended right, because we remove the right lobe and just remove the base of segment 4. Like you'll see in our operative images, we can just remove the base of segment 4 and then divide the bile duct at the umbilical fissure. Thereby we will be getting a parenchymal margin and a good bile duct margin without actually resecting the segment 4 and preserving a very important bit of liver parenchyma to prevent the postoperative liver failure. Likewise, for the type, the type 3B, like we discussed, when the sectoral separation is there, obviously we need to go for a left hepatectomy. Sometimes for type 1 and type 2, obviously a left hepatectomy is simpler and the choroid lobe is resected, and if we are able to get a good margin on the right ducts in sometimes in the elderly high risk patients whom we feel despite all the preoperative preparation, there's still high risk for right hepatectomy, we can, for type 1 tumors and type 2 tumors, if we're able to get a margin on the right side, we can do a left hepatectomy. But the bile duct anastomosis in these patients would be a bit complicated. We'll see that in the operative part. For selected type 4, as we discussed, the entire left lobe, the right anterior can be removed, and segment 6 and 7 can be preserved. We do a left trisectionectomy. Always, any of these resections, we combine with a choroid lobectomy, like I discussed, for 2 reasons. One, the choroid lobe is in direct contact with the hilum, so the choroid lymphatics and the choroid parenchyma gets infiltrated, and also the choroid bile ducts are the first ones to get involved. If you don't resect it, you're likely to have a positive margin. Then other things before you go into surgery, the role of staging laparoscopy, the incidence of peritoneal disease is 10%. I mean, in the West, there's a huge debate for malignancy. Should we do a staging laparoscopy? Should we not do a staging laparoscopy? I think in India, the additional cost, we use mostly reusable instruments. The additional cost of a peritoneal laparoscopy is not much, and I don't think we should debate it much, especially in patients with high CA99, like we discussed before, and suspected extrahepatic disease on imaging and all that. We you should always go for a staging laparoscopy. Even the nodular type, intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, always a staging laparoscopy is mandated. One more group is the peritoneal wash. I mean, but routine peritoneal wash for PCR and cytology has not proven to be of any additional benefit. A lymph node dissection for the hyalocholangiosarcoma, a standard lymph node dissection, the hepatoduodenal ligament, the posterior retropancreatic nodes, the common hepatic nodes till the right of celiac origin, like we do for the gallbladder cancer, is indicated. External lymphadenectomy, doing a complete serial lymph node dissection, SMA nodes, and the intra-aortocaval nodes, external lymph node dissection has had no survival benefit. More than for the curative benefit, obviously the lymph node dissection not just helps in local control, the prognostication, because if we don't do the adequate lymph node dissection, we may understage the patients, and lymph node positive patients need chemotherapy, and these patients have a poorer survival. And another important point is R0 resections. Definitely an R0 resection is the preferred resection for hyalocholangiosarcomas. So when you do let's say right hepatectomy and you divide the left duct, is there a role for a intraoperative frozen section? Normally you would think that the answer is yes, but actually its role is a bit doubtful. So for example, when they looked at patients in whom the margin, the intraoperative frozen section margin is positive, and then the patients in whom intraoperative frozen section is positive, they did a re-excision and the margin is negative, and then there's a patients group in whom the R0, the patients in whom the intraoperative frozen section was positive and they had to do a re-excision did badly, like the patients with the positive margin. That means the intraoperative frozen section being positive and need for reverse margins is usually a marker for poor biological behavior, poor tumor biology, and a more aggressive tumor. So normally what we do is, beyond a point, there's not much scope for margin in high lung. It's not like a lower CBD when you can get a huge margin. You can get up to at least 1 centimeter margin. If you can get, we divide the bile duct as high as possible, beyond which we cannot go. And so we get the maximum possible margin. And literature has shown that patients with R1 resections also, microscopic margin positive, also have a survival benefit compared to patients who don't undergo surgery. And this is one point, very important point I'd like to make. Patients, operable hyalocholangiocarcinomas, for some reason they undergo biliary stenting, the stents get blocked, then they try ERCP, they do one more PTBD, liver abscesses, PCD, perihepatic abscesses, and this kind of, the patients sort of become biliary cripples. If you actually closely follow up these patients with hyalocholangiocarcinoma which are managed by stenting, the tumor progresses, segmental, subsegmental ducts become isolated, they are infected, and they become biliary cripples. Their 6 to 8 months of life they have is miserable, with jaundice, poor appetite, recurrent smoldering sepsis, and recurrent cholangitis, recurrent hospital admissions. While a patient, even if you have microscopic margin positive after a radical resection, the kind of life they have, the 2.5 years of life they have a good life with no cholangitis and jaundice free and itching free. So even if in R1, if you, of course, we don't plan for R1 resections, but if it is a microscopic margin positive, even then you can say based on literature that these patients do have a survival benefit, and more importantly, a quality of life benefit compared to not operating on them. The vascular resections, the philosophy is same as I said for hyalocholangiocarcinoma, in Whipple's. Portal vein resections, patients with portal vein resection, patients without portal vein resection achieving R0 margin, they had comparable long-term survival. Definitely there is increased morbidity because the portal vein clamping, you have to do the hepaticojejunostomy in the edematous belt. There is increased morbidity in patients with portal vein resection, but in experienced high volume centers, there is no increased mortality, and definitely portal vein encasement of even the main portal vein is not a contraindication in hyalocholangiocarcinoma. But on the other hand, the same like philosophy as in Whipple's, hepatic artery, if it is increased, there are still some surgeons, even transplant surgeons, who would like to resect the hepatic artery also in hyalocholangiocarcinoma. There is increased morbidity and mortality, there is no survival benefit, and routine resection of the hepatic artery is contraindicated in surgery for hyalocholangiocarcinoma. Neuhaus in 1999 developed the no-touch technique. Unfortunately, I didn't have an image of this today, but in which basically he doesn't do any hilar dissection. Routinely, for doing a right hepatectomy, obviously the left hepatic artery is free. Routinely, the entire length of the portal vein is resected, irrespective of whether it's involved or not, so that there's no hilar dissection, there's no touch technique. And with that, he showed better survival in his series compared to the conventional technique. But somehow this has not been adapted widely in the worldwide, because many of those patients, the histology revealed that it was not actually tumor involving the portal vein, but actually the peritumoral fibrosis. So it's not a very widely followed technique, the Neuhaus technique. So before we go into the actual surgical technique, let's look at a couple of illustrative cases. So this is a patient with hyalocholangiocarcinoma. You can see it's a type 2 hyalocholangiocarcinoma, right, left are separated. The left you have, these are not the segment 4 ducts, these are the caudate ducts. So by the axial sections we can make out, and these are the caudate ducts, these are the segment 4B and 4A ducts. So there's a big margin from the hilum to they have about a 3 centimeter margin. So this patient undergoes a left PTBD, he's undergone a left PTBD. We've done a right portal vein embolization. You can see the coils. And so the left lobe hypertrophies, once the jaundice comes down, we do the embolization, then we wait 3 weeks. And then this patient undergoes a extended right hepatectomy. You can see the common bile duct, the circuitrizing. See how the tumor looks, a really fibrous, shriveled kind of tumor, and a left duct margin here. And here, it's the left hepaticojejunostomy. We do the left hepaticojejunostomy for these patients. Obviously, the right lobe has been removed, so we do the left hepaticojejunostomy. So in doing the right hepatectomy, I mean, just of academic interest is the ALPS procedure. This was one of the patients in whom we had done an ALPS. ALPS is basically associating liver partition with portal ligation for staged hepatectomy. That's the full form of ALPS. So you do liver partition and portal vein ligation. So let's do planning. You're doing a right hepatectomy. You partition the liver. The liver, you can see the clips here. The liver has been transected, and you have ligated the portal vein. So this now, like I said, in hydrocholangiocarcinomas, we're not using this. This is a patient of a child's age cirrhosis in whom I had done a ALPS. So you can see the liver right lobe is completely mobilized in the first surgery itself. Because once the left lobe hypertrophy is 10 days later, like in ALPS, we wait only for 10 days. We don't wait for 3 to 4 weeks because the hypertrophy is very rapid. So we actually mobilize the right lobe completely. The portal vein is ligated and the parenchymal transaction is completed till the IVC. So then we wait 7 to 10 days. And you see the amount of hypertrophy in the left lobe compared to the initial images. There's significant hypertrophy of the left lobe. So we've gone back in. These are the surfaces. There are minimal bile leaks, but there's no major collections. And in this surgery, we do only very little in the second stage. We just cut the portal vein, cut the hepatic vein and bile duct and get the specimen out. So that's the portal vein stump, the hepatic artery stump, and the hepatic vein stump. So all this thing we do in the first stage itself. So if you don't have a good radiology backup and the patient is willing for this kind of a thing, after proper counseling, ALPS is a good way in diseased livers to plan a major hepatectomy. So that is case one. We saw the right hepatectomy, this kind of a right hepatectomy. This is another case. There's a type 3B hydrocholangiocarcinoma. You can see the right anterior, right posterior joining. The left segment 4, 2, 3, all are separated. So it's a type 3B tumor. So you can see the CT, the portal vein is encased and gone here, and the left lobe is atrophic. So in this kind of a patient, obviously, we're going to get a margin on the right side. So we do a left hepatectomy with a chordate lobectomy and en bloc excision of the extrahepatic bile duct. And then we do a right hepatococyginostomy. Like, only problem when you do right hepatococyginostomies, which we were discussing previously, is, see here in this patient, how many ducts we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you might get multiple. The more higher you go for a margin, the biliary reconstruction becomes extremely common. In this patient, we did the hepatococyginostomy. Luckily, all these are contained within the cystic plate, so it's not technically extremely challenging. But so as you go more on the right side, you get more sort of multiple bile ducts here. So our experience, I mean, we've explored 58 patients. Sometimes patients, after a portal vein embolization also, we've unfortunately found dissemination. We don't routinely do a diagnostic laparoscopy before a portal vein embolization, but yes, sometimes you can have disseminated disease. We had a couple of cases in whom the locally advanced tumor, because the longitudinal spread was too much, we had to do a HPD, and because of the various issues and fitness of the patient, we decided not to go with it. So for most of the right side, the big message in this is the most of the right-sided portal vein right-sided hepatectomies, out of the 26, almost 20 underwent a portal vein embolization. Only 6 did not undergo portal vein. So like I said, if most of the time for right-sided resections, unless of course a really poor or a very young and a very fit patient, if the liver volume is less than 40%, in my practice, for safety, we would go in for a portal vein embolization. Like left, of course. And left hepatectomy always for type 3B, most of the time, because the left lobe is atrophic or the left portal vein is encased. In these kind of patients, obviously the morbidity and mortalities are very less in the left-sided resections. So sometimes the same principles which you follow for a hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you would have to follow for other tumors. For example, HCC with the bile duct thrombus kind of thing. So this patient is a biliary cystadenocarcinoma of the left lobe of the liver with a tumor thrombus. You can see the tumor thrombus. The tumor is in the left lobe of the liver, tumor thrombus extending into the bile duct. So in this patient, we did a left hepatectomy with a chordate lobectomy and a complete bile duct excision. You can see the bile duct distended by the tumor. And here and of course, after the resection, we did the right hepatococyginostomy. Here again, you see the multiple bile ducts on the right side. And this is a specimen just showing the cut open cystic tumor with the part. And this is the tumor extending. You can see the solid component of the tumor extending along the bile duct into the biliary tree. And the left hepatectomy with chordate lobectomy and bile duct excision has been done. So sometimes for HCC with bile duct thrombus and this kind of cystadenocarcinomas with biliary extension, you might have to do a surgery as you do, following the same principles as you do for hyalocholangiocarcinoma, though they are not hylar tumors. Now we'll talk about the steps of a right hepatectomy with a choroidal lobectomy, which is, like I said, the commonest surgery done for a uh, type 1, type 2, or type 3A hyalocholangiocarcinomas. So basically what you have here is the first, the incision is usually, now we put a right-sided Makuchi incision. Sometimes you may, if your left lobe is like large and you're having some difficulty in mobilizing the left lobe, you can go for a Mercedes-Benz incision, but most of the time we do a right-sided Makuchi incision. The first step would be, we start the dissection at the upper border of the duodenum, divide the structures there. Then we confirm the main portal vein and the main hepatic artery are safe, that they are free, they're not encased by the tumor. Following which, the first step would be after assessing the left hepatic artery, left portal vein, main hepatic artery, main portal vein, divide the bile duct early. So this is the bile duct we are dividing here. This is the catheters which are coming out, the PDPD catheters that are inside. So dividing the bile duct early, because don't try to sling the portal vein and all without dividing the bile duct, because in these tumors, there's a lot of desmoplastic reaction and sometimes actual tumor encasement between the tumor and the portal vein confluence. So if you do it without proper exposure, which you do in a normal hepatectomy or a living donor, because of the encasement, you might actually get into trouble. So at least in this kind of situation, the bile duct is already excised and lifted up, the dissection is good, and if you have an encasement, you can plan for a portal vein resection much better. Then once the bile duct is excised and we dissect out the right hepatic artery is being divided here. The right portal vein has been slung. So again, in these patients, the portal vein dissection in hyalocholangiocarcinoma, because of tumor infiltration or desmoplasia, is usually very difficult. We should be doing it very meticulously. We should not injure the choroid branches behind the portal vein. We should ligate the choroid branches from the left lobe to the left portal vein to the choroid lobe, because the entire choroid lobe is going to come out. And another very important principle, because the fibrosis and all, always before you're ligating, isolating and dividing the left portal vein, keep the main portal vein and the left portal vein in view and make sure that they're not getting narrowed. So here we're dividing the left portal vein and oversewing it. The next is the posterior mobilization. Posterior mobilization, we take off all the choroid lobes. Compared to standard hepatectomy, we only go till the midline of the IVC. In this, we can continue the choroid mobilization onto the left side as well, across the midline of the IVC, and continue the choroid mobilization. Once we this is the Makuchi ligament. Once we've divided also, the entire retrohepatic IVC comes into view, and we do the RHV isolation. The right hepatic vein is isolated here, and which the RHV based hanging maneuver can be done to facilitate the parenchymal transection. So the parenchymal transection, yes, I mean, it can be, once the discoloration comes, we start the parenchymal transection with a harmonic, and most of the time we use the two-surgeon technique. The surgeon on the right uses the Huser, harmonic, and the Liga clips, while the surgeon on the left uses the suction and the bipolar. So the big difference between a standard right hepatectomy and a hyalocholangiocarcinoma. Standard right hepatectomy, you divide the right portal vein, right hepatic artery, you go down like this, you divide the right bile duct, and the choroid leg gets left behind. Here in hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you come the right, again same, the right portal vein, right hepatic artery are divided. You come here, you turn along the base of segment. The base of segment 4, because it is in direct contact with the hilum, the base of segment 4 is dissected, and then the contrete choroid lobe is removed. So you can see, make out the difference between this plane of transection and this plane of transection. So that is the big difference between a standard right hepatectomy and a extended right with an en bloc choroid resection. Why we call it an extended right is because we're taking a bit of segment 4 along with the right hepatectomy and the choroid lobe. So the parenchymal transection, like I said, it's by combination of Huser, harmonic, and as we go along, the right hepatic vein is transected here. The choroid, like I said, it's completely mobilized. Then we do the left hepatic vein slinging. So for that, again, we'll discuss we divide the Allansius ligament, that is the remnant of the ductus venosus connecting the left portal vein to the left hepatic vein. So once we divide the Allansius ligament, this is the Allansius ligament we're dividing here, we get the access to the lateral and the infrahepatic IVC. So once you divide the Allansius ligament, you can sling the left and the middle hepatic vein branch. So left and middle hepatic vein branch are slung. So what is the advantage of, so this is, you can see the left and middle trunk has been slung. What is the advantage of doing this? Basically, the upper border of the caudate lobe lies anteriorly anteriorly there is the porta, posteriorly there is the IVC, and superiorly at the upper border of caudate lobe you have the left and the middle hepatic vein trunk. So normally if you go completely resect the hammer in the last, completely resect the caudate lobe in the last part of the transition, as you come down like this and you're going in this plane, you will, or inevitably you will hit the hepatic veins, and you're at risk of causing a major injury to the hepatic venous outflow of the remnant. So likewise, for example, when you have a accessory left hepatic duct which is entering this thing, when your plane of transition, obviously you're coming above the caudate lobe, entering the umbilical fissure. When you do that, if you are also at a risk of injuring the accessory left hepatic artery. So this umbilical tape we've passed like this. So this umbilical tape is taken below between the caudate lobe and the MHV LHV, that is below the MHV LHV, below the accessory left hepatic artery, and below the left portal pedicle. So like I said here, that the caudate lobe has come below the hepatic veins, below the below the structure, beneath this, and also beneath the portal vein. So what it does is, during your transition, it is protecting all these. All these are outside the structure, outside the sling. So when your transition goes till here, you're actually protecting the veins. I mean, in fact, in our YouTube channel, you'll find a video of hyalocholangiocarcinoma in which this left-sided hanging maneuver and its significance is well explained. So, like I said, like in the last part of the caudate sublation, we're using the tape as a guide. So if you see the video, you'll understand better as we follow the tape as a guide, and this tape is protecting the left and the middle hepatic vein, and likewise any accessory or replaced left hepatic artery. So we are completing the caudate lobe dissection by cutting onto the tape here, as you can see. So at the completion of the hepatectomy, you can see that the caudate lobe and all is been excised, and now the reconstruction. So left side is a very large bile duct to which we are doing a hepatogegenostomy, right? Hepatogegenostomy. That's the completed hepatogegenostomy of the left side. Like said, when you do for the right side, we say we might, most of the time, yeah, we at least have 2 ducts, usually 4 ducts. So we're doing a right-sided hepatogegenostomy after a left hepatectomy. This is another patient in which the hepatogegenostomy, you can see the multiple ducts are there. So we're doing a single anastomosis because all these are usually contained within the Glisonian, within the hilar plate. And that's the completed right hepatogegenostomy. That's the extended right hepatectomy specimen with the caudate lobe, the right lobe of the liver, and the extrahepatic biliary tree. You can see the tumor and the amount of margin. So to achieve this margin, we have to do such a major resection, because on the right side, even this kind of margin is not achievable. Especially, you know, when there's a lot of dissection normally. So one big difference between the traditional right hepatectomy and hyalocholangio is, in the traditional right hepatectomy, if I'm doing a right hepatectomy, I dissect only the right hepatic artery and right portal vein. But in a normal, in a hyalocholangiocarcinoma, you are dissecting all the lymphatics of the left hepatic vein, left portal vein during the part of your hepatoduodenal ligament dissection. Also, many times, a lot of handling, sometimes portal vein resection is also required. So at the completion, we usually do an on-table Doppler. One final thing about transplantation. So locally advanced inoperable hyalocholangiocarcinomas, inoperable locally advanced non-metastatic hyalocholangiocarcinomas, they do very poorly. Without R0 resection, the 5-year survival of these patients is less than 5%. Like when you do with chemotherapy or endoluminal stenting or endoluminal RFA combined with stenting, the average survival in literature is barely 8 to 9 months. So in this group of locally advanced hyalocholangiocarcinoma, Mayo protocol, basically a combination of external beam radiotherapy with brachytherapy, which is delivered through PTPD catheters, followed by chemotherapy with 5-FU and capecitabine. They have had excellent 5-year survival. In these kind of patients in which the 5-year survival less than 5%, they showed fantastic results of neoadjuvant downstaging therapy followed by liver transplantation. 60% 5-year survival. The same Mayo protocol was replicated with similar results in several European centers. There are some contraindications, tumor below the cystic duct, because once you go below the cystic duct, the tumor can spread into the pancreaticoduodenal lymphatics. So tumor below the cystic duct, tumor which is more than 3 centimeters in length, and any extrahepatic disease, obviously, and transperitoneal biopsy are contraindications. Patients who don't respond to neoadjuvant chemotherapy, whose CA99 remains more than 500 despite the jaundice coming down, and despite the drainage and the neoadjuvant chemotherapy, if the CA99 remains high, and patients with portal vein encasement are the ones who didn't come within the 50%, 60% survival. These are so the non-responders to neoadjuvant chemotherapy with persistent elevated CA99 and portal vein encasement are poor prognosis. So transplantation has a definite role in high local angiocarcinoma in locally advanced cases. Likewise, in primary sclerosing cholangitis with hyalocholangiocarcinoma. So in these kind of patients, for major resection, they have two problems. One is the actual malignancy, and the other is the actual liver dysfunction. So because of the primary PSC, there is usually liver fibrosis, sometimes liver cirrhosis, and so they're not fit for a major hepatectomy. These patients usually present late, and traditionally they don't do great. So they most of the time they present as locally advanced, number one, and they're not fit for a hepatectomy because of the poor liver function. So in these kind of patients, the survival is less than 20%. In these patients, transplant has a major role in high local angiocarcinoma with 70% 5-year survival, which is excellent. So it is the standard of care in PSC with high local angiocarcinoma. So the results of surgery, it's like, I think the points to note in this is that it's a fairly high morbidity surgery. I mean, bile leaks, post-operative liver dysfunction, because we're doing a major hepatectomy in a cholestatic liver, not a healthy liver. Then post-operative liver dysfunction, then wound infections. These are all fairly common because it's a supramajor surgery. And the mortality is usually less than, now I think we talk about, these are slightly older series. It is in the range of less than 5%, 5 to 10% mortality in high volume centers. The overall survival is around 5-year survival is around 30 to 40% in these patients. And like I said, the more important thing is not just the survival, it is the quality of life during this period, which is much better compared to palliative procedures. The R1 disease, microscopic margins positive, lymph node metastasis, and highest T stage have a poorer prognosis. Adjuvant therapy, again, in adjuvant therapy, like you guys oncologists must be seeing in your CA breast or colon cancer, the radiation therapy, in retrospect, there's a lot of retrospective trials. We don't have a really lot of high quality data because these tumors are not such common tumors. There is clear-cut role that radiation therapy increases both local control and survival in patients who are margin positive. So if you do a high local angio and the margin is positive, it is mandatory that you give the patient post-operative radiotherapy to the tumor bed. There's IO, intraoperative radiotherapy combination also improves results. Our experience in India is almost negligible in this area, at least for Hylas. Adjuvant chemotherapy, again, in adjuvant chemotherapy, the problem with high local angio, there's relatively less common tumors, that quality of evidence is less. We don't have level 1 evidence like for colon cancers and breast, like for some examples. Most of the trials have looked at biliary malignancies as a group. That means they've clubbed high local angiocarcinomas with mid CBD cancers and lower CBD cancers. So, but in two trials, the SCAP3 trial and the BILCAP trial, adjuvant chemotherapy, 5-FU gemcitabine. The BILCAP trial, I think, was capecitabine. So these two trials have shown a definitive survival advantage of adjuvant therapy in the high local angiocarcinoma group, while the BCAT trial showed no benefit. So, but according to the current NCCN guidelines, if they have lymph node positive disease or your margins are positive, NCCN guidelines say that you need adjuvant therapy. So the question came like you guys might be in the pelvic tumors. The pelvis is a narrow area. The circumferential involvement is high. So to get a good circumferential margin is difficult. So we gave neoadjuvant downstaging treatment for rectal cancer. Can we use the same philosophy and give the same sort of neoadjuvant treatment for high local angiocarcinoma? So for resectable high local angiocarcinoma, the same thing was tried, but it has found to have no benefit. For resectable high local angiocarcinoma, there's no role for neoadjuvant chemotherapy like we're trying in gastric or pancreatic cancer because of the various problems of catheter dislodgement, jaundice recurrence, and the high morbidity of waiting. This delays surgery up to 7 months and is associated with the decreased survival. However, for locally advanced, Again, there is no level 1 evidence, but we may try in the setting of a trial. But there's no level 1 evidence for neoadjuvant therapy in high local angiocarcinoma. Photodynamic therapy, palliative chemotherapy, radiofrequency ablation. I think, like I said, our talk is mainly dealing with operable high local angiocarcinomas, but as a part of palliative therapy, these things, RFA and PDT, help improve stent patency rates. To conclude, high local angiocarcinomas definitely are treated surgically. In our country, especially, a lot of time is wasted in trying to drain multiple ducts and trying to establish a histology. I think the surgeons, the oncologists, and the gastroenterologists need to be aware that too much insistence of histology is not there, and many of these patients after resection have not just a better survival but a much higher quality of life. So surgery is the highest treatment of choice. It's a truly multidisciplinary care. I mean, the preoperative drainage involves the gastroenterologist, the interventional radiologist, the surgeon, and postoperative physiotherapist, nutritional care, all that are to be involved. And like I said, I think I keep telling our juniors that if you can understand the surgery of a high local angiocarcinoma, the one which I described now, you've basically mastered liver surgery, because you have to sling all the acts and access all the hepatic veins and do a complete lymph node dissection, do a retrohepatic dissection. So technically also it's a very challenging but satisfying surgery. And centers with good interventional radiology and ICU backup and a sufficient volume can give excellent results for these tumors. As surgery is the only way, and arterial resection is the only way to have a reasonable long-term survival and a good quality of life. To just, as the last slide, this is one patient which we had, this slide I made yesterday, the only slide I made yesterday, just highlights the kind of topsy-turvy course which we have in high local angiocarcinoma. This guy, he came in with a type 3A high local angiocarcinoma, which is resectable on the CT scan. He underwent a left PTBD, and then the jaundice came down to less than 7. So we did a right portal vein embolization, then waited for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he continued to have fever. Unlike in other cancers, in the presence of cholangitis or fever, we should never operate. Even in other cancers, we should not, but especially in high local angiocarcinoma, because with your handling and a major hepatectomy in the presence of sepsis, the patient will definitely have a fulminant course. So I prefer our patient should not have any fever and normal CRP for a week at least before the surgery. So we brought this patient back in. We did a right anterior PTBD and a right. So we did right anterior and right posterior, 2 PTBDs. So finally the patient had 3 PTBDs. And then we another week later, once the patient was sepsis free, fever free, we brought him in for surgery. We did the volumetry. The hypertrophy was only 6% because our isolated segment 7 branch was missed. And then when we were planning to take him up for surgery, he came COVID positive. So there was COVID positive, CORADS 5, CT score was 8 by 25. So CT severity was 8 by 25. So we discharged him, managed him medically at home. And we waited for 3 weeks and we repeated a COVID PCR twice, which was negative. And then we brought him. We would have liked to wait for longer, but like I said, if the longer you wait, the right side catheters, especially because the left is internalized. You can see the left catheter is internalized, but the right are not internalized. If they're dislodged, there'll be bile leak and a lot of other morbidity. So we did an extended right hepatectomy, and despite all the topsy-turvy course he had, because of proper preoperative planning, this patient was discharged by day 6. I mean, this is a picture which in fact I had taken today morning during my rounds. So thanks a lot, for your patient hearing. I know it was long, and it's a very interesting topic, a very undertreated and neglected area by all our by our oncologists and surgeons. So I just wanted to highlight the major points for a deeper and a better understanding. Thanks to all these centers which over the years have helped me gain my training in surgery: JIPMER, Sanjay Gandhi, Japan, where I trained, the Kurume University, St. James University Hospital, the Asan Medical Center in Korea, and of course, last but not the least, Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, where I worked. So thanks to all these centers for helping me develop my skills.